Hello, everyone. Today I'll be discussing my instructional resource, which focuses on teaching complex sentences through subordinating conjunctions in Year 5. The purpose of my resource is to explicitly teach students how independent and dependent clauses can be connected using subordinating conjunctions to create an effective complex sentence. Rather than expecting students to simply recognize complex sentences, I would like them to understand how they are constructed and why writers use them. This is important because sentence level knowledge provides students with greater control over their writing and allows them to communicate relationships between ideas more clearly. Before teaching this lesson, I'd consider where complex sentences fit within students' broader development of grammar and sentence structure. As shown in the progression, students first need to understand that ideas can be connected with through sentences. They need then to have an understanding of clauses before progressing towards complex sentences and eventually using different sentence structures intentionally for effect. This progression is important because I don't want students to simply memorize a list of subordinating conjunctions. They need to understand the grammatical structures these conjunctions are connecting. For example, students need to understand the difference between the dog bark loudly, which can stand independently, and although it was raining, which can communicate a complete idea by itself. My instruction therefore breaks complex sentences into manageable components before putting these components back together. My approach is also informed by the writing rope shown here from Sedita. The writing rope demonstrates that skilled writing involves several interconnected strands, including critical thinking, syntax, text structure, writing, craft, and transcription. My lesson particularly focuses on the syntax strand. Uh, Teaching complex sentences is therefore not an isolated grammar activity. Developing students' understanding of syntax can provide them with a greater control over how they construct and communicate ideas in their own writing. For Year 5 students, this becomes increasingly important as the ideas they communicate become more sophisticated. Students need sentence structure that allows them to communicate relationships such as time, cause and effect, condition, and contrast. For example, Sophie kept running, she felt tired. Students can create, although Sophie felt tired, she kept running. The information is similar, but the complex sentence communicates the relationship between those ideas much more effectively. The main pedagogical strategy underpinning my resource is the explicit instruction through the gradual release of responsibility model, commonly represented as the I do, we do, and you do. The Pearson and Gallagher model involves gradually transferring responsibility from teachers, modeling towards students' independence. My resource combines this with principles of explicit instruction supported by the Australian Education Research Organisation. I selected this approach because complex sentences contain several pieces of information that students need to coordinate simultaneously. Um, they need to identify clauses, understand whether those clauses can stand independently or dependently, select an appropriate subordinating conjunction, and then combine the ideas into a grammatical correct sentence. Rather than presenting all of these at once and then expecting the students to discover the pattern themselves, the explicit instruction allows them to break the learning into smaller steps, modeling and thinking and providing guidance practice before independently applying their knowledge. There'll be two visual resources supported by the explicit instruction model. The first is the I saw a wub display, which provides students with examples of subordinating conjunctions. And then the second anchor chart showing the difference between independent and dependent clauses. These resources are not intended to replace explicit teaching. Instead, they act as scaffolds students can refer back to during the guided and independent practice. This is also particularly useful because students do not have to rely entirely on memory while simultaneously constructing a complex sentence. I then would begin my lesson. So the learning intentions I am learning to use subordinating conjunctions to join independent and dependent clauses to create effective and complex sentences. So then we would transition into the I do stage. I'll explicitly explain that a complex sentence contains an independent clause and a dependent clause connected by a subordinating conjunction. I'll give the example: the boy ran home because it was raining. Identify the boy ran home as the independent clause because it can stand alone and communicate a complete idea. Because it is the subordinating conjunction, and it was raining is the dependent clause. I then separately model that what makes a clause independent or dependent. An important part of this stage is the think aloud rather than just giving students the answer. I would verbalize how I determine whether a clause can stand alone or not. This makes the thinking process visible to students. The lesson then will move into the guided practice part of the model. Students are shown examples and asked to determine whether each is an independent or a dependent clause, so through a thumbs up or a thumbs down. For the first one, for example, Ruby found the old map. Students need to consider whether this communicates a complete idea. And then another example, although it was raining, probably get a thumbs down. Students would recognize that something is missing and that the idea depends on another clause. This stage allows me to use questioning and immediate feedback to identify misconceptions before students move on to their independent work. This is important reason for using gradual release. If students cannot reliably distinguish between the two types of clauses, asking them to do the independent work and constructing complex sentences would be premature and they wouldn't be able to complete the task. Finally, students will complete this worksheet as a part of the you do stage. Um, Using it's the worksheet's built up into two parts, part A and part B. Part A requires students to identify the independent clause, subordinating conjunction, and dependent clause within a complete sentence using different colors to highlight different clauses. Part B is where it increases the level of application. Students select an appropriate subordinating conjunction and combine two ideas to create a meaningful, complex sentence. I deliberately designed the worksheet this way because it progresses from identification to construction. The quick check at the end also encourages students to consider whether their sentence contains an independent clause, a dependent clause, a subordinating conjunction, and whether the complete sentence makes sense and uses correct punctuation. This provides meaningful formative assessment information. If a student can identify clauses but struggles to construct their own sentence, I know that the next instructional step needs to focus on applying the grammatical knowledge rather than just simply identifying the terms. Um, and then finally, overall, the purpose of this resource is not just simply to teach students a list of subordinating conjunctions. It is to develop their understanding of how complex sentences work and how they can use them purposefully and in their own writing. The combination of explicit instruction, visual scaffolds, guided practice, and independent application provides a structured progression towards independence. By moving from understanding clauses to identifying their relationships and finally constructing complex sentences, the lesson supports Year 5 students to develop their syntactic knowledge and greater control over their own writing. Thank you very much.